G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas, and what exciting times for this old project, which is about to expand massively. Great news, Uncomfortable Conversations will now become my main gig in the new year, meaning that you will get a lot more episodes, you will get them in video form instead of just audio. And we'll be branching out and providing you with a lot more content. If you've ever been on the fence about whether or not to become a premium subscriber, I would tactfully suggest that you do so now. It's probably worth getting ahead of whatever it is that we roll out in the new year. There will be benefits to people who got in ahead of the game. uncomfortableconversations.substack.com. It's very easy. You don't even necessarily need a credit card yet. If you don't want to become a premium subscriber, you can just become part of the community for free just by entering your email address, and then at least you'll be kept up to date with whatever wonderful things we're rolling out. If you didn't hear the news in the rest of the press, I'm resigned from my ABC radio show last week. I'm super excited. I'm super grateful to everybody at the ABC. Wish them all the best, and it's incredibly liberated and over the moon about this next chapter of my media adventure. And before embarking on my own path, I wanted to speak with the most successful person who has recently pulled that off. Bari Weiss is perhaps the most successful independent media pioneer in the United States, perhaps the world. She used to be an opinion writer and editor at the New York Times. Before that, she was an op-ed and book review editor at the Wall Street Journal and a senior editor at Tablet magazine. And you will hear in this conversation her account of her exit from the New York Times, which certainly has some resonance. I am certainly empathetic, shall we say, to Bari's experience, to put it tactfully. She went off and founded an entire media company called The Free Press, of which she is now the editor. There's so much we could have talked about. I love Bari's mind. I could follow it down a million rabbit holes for a million hours, but enjoy what we could discuss with the one and only Bari Weiss.
How's my hair?
Your hair is always fabulous, baby. Fabulous. You always look divine.
You're so sweet. I really don't. We both know I gained, you don't know this, I gained so much weight in COVID basically from drinking, but then I went on Ozempic and solved the whole problem.
Get the fuck out of here. I did exactly the same thing without the Ozempic part. I put on like 20 pounds in the first year of the pandemic. Ice cream and Netflix will do that. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to become a fat man. You know, it was like there was that moment where I was like, if I don't change something, I will just be I will be a portly gentleman.
I mean, you look
swaggering about.
You look way skinnier than when I met you. Wait, hold on one second. Yeah. So my hair is like all in the tape. It's really bothering me. Hold on one second. I'm sorry.
See, this is when you get to a certain level of success, you become a diva about your earphones.
Just completely.
Yeah. Do you prefer it that way?
Yeah, so much better. Oh yeah.
Better? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
You're right. And then so after I put on 20 kilos, then 20 pounds, then I lost like 50 pounds in the second year.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're the most svelte I've ever seen you by far.
Thank you. Thank you very much. God bless you. You too. So the Ozempic's working out. Are you still on it?
It worked out. God knows what kind of weird cancer I've given myself, but at least I'm skinny for a minute.
Well, I actually did a story yesterday on my soon-to-be no longer radio show about Ozempic in Australia, and the dietitian was saying, it is great, but you are mostly losing like muscle and bone and stuff. So it makes you skinny, but sort of haggard. But you don't look haggard.
Do I look haggard?
No, you look bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
I mean, I have no bones left in my body, and
so basically a suit of just muscle and flesh.
What's left of my organ? I mean, yeah. Anyway, we could go on about this, Josh. But
how are you, my love? How are you holding up in these insane times?
I have to be honest. It's been like one long day since October 7th. Like I've never experienced time in this way. I mean, the only thing that's comparable to it, I guess, is when we had the baby and sort of like the sleeplessness and the way that the days would bleed into each other. It's been a little like that. But yeah, October 7th happened, and then I looked up and now it's Well, you guys don't have Thanksgiving, but Thanksgiving. And
I did Thanksgiving this weekend for the first time in Australia, Barry, because I'm married to an American bloke.
I know.
Every year he says, every year after Thanksgiving, he's like, I wish we could kind of bring Thanksgiving here. And I was like, this year I was like, there will be no regrets. Your wish is like a man.
So did you
We're going to invite
Did you make the turkey?
Yeah, I made a turkey. I made the first turkey of my life. It was delicious. Gosh. I was shitting liquid for the next 24 hours. So I don't know if I did something wrong, but
I got to tell you,
it was delicious at the time.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah, we had some friends
remember when I was in Australia? Those were the days. Those were the simple times.
I was just starting out. I was full of promise about the mainstream media and all of the opportunities that it would provide me with.
And now you're a liberated man. I was just catching up on all of it.
Amazing. I mean, so, I'd love being driven out of your place of work because a risk-averse corporation can't handle the range of perspectives you want to wrestle with is not something that you would be familiar with, Barry.
Not at all. I have no idea what you're talking about.
I want to talk about...
But Josh, the thing about you is you always seemed like so reasonable. Like,
well, thank you.
Is your sort of, I don't know if it was a self-deportation or...
It was a self-deportation. When it reached a certain level.
Yeah.
But you know what? It's hard. I don't know what it was like.
But
for
I was going to say, is the Australian context even more sort of narrow than the American one? Because maybe
it's narrower but less hostile, I thought. Like less partisan and less divided, but maybe because of that, more unaware of its own boundaries, the boundary of the tightness of the echo chamber, of the thought silo, perhaps. I mean, it's one of those things where when people ask, did I jump or was I pushed? It's actually a little bit hard to know because there are so many factions inside the organization that you're not aware of what they're actually wanting. So things come at you and you go, are they just being unreasonable or do they know that this is going to push me out?
I mean, there's a zillion things I want to ask you about it, but I don't know if you want to go there.
I don't. We will catch up perhaps on the air or perhaps off the air sometime in 2024.
Are you coming to the States at all?
Yeah, I will. I'll do a victory lap when I launch the new podcast. Maybe I'll have a set as beautiful as yours because we're now going to expand this operation and do it all legit because I don't want to be employed by another employer. I'm just going to be solo like you. So that'll mean beautiful library-style sets like the one. I'm so
glad it looks that. I wish you could see the broader room that we're in, but we've learned how to fake lumps on the cheap.
Is this a soundstage in Culver City?
No, we're in a former casting office in Los Angeles. That, I mean, the level of schmutz in this building. I really can't quantify it for you.
It looks fabulous, and I'm so delighted that you've created the empire.
It's really because, as much as it can look like a solo act, the only reason that I'm not sort of in some basement looking, in terrible lighting is because I'm working with just unbelievable people who have been joining the Free Press since it became the Free Press a year ago, and there's 20 people that work here now, which is it's crazy.
How do you pay them all, or do they eat like cat food?
No, people eat very well here. Wagyu beef burgers for lunch often.
I could tell that you had 20 people because before you came to air, there were about 17 12-year-olds running around fixing everything for you.
Right,
it was
mostly child labor helps.
I want this. Australian labor laws.
We can talk. I mean, I think a big question you will face, and maybe you already know the answer to it because a lot of it is personality driven, is whether or not you want to be working essentially completely alone on the Josh Zepps, show, or if you want to sort of build a new institution. And it became clear to me that is what I wanted to do. Foolishly, I had no idea sort of how absolutely difficult that was going to be. I had no ambition to be an entrepreneur, a startup person, any of that stuff. But here I am, no Sam Altman, but doing what I can to build a new media company.
Sam Altman without the jail fraud part.
No, you're talking about Sam Bankman-Fried.
Sam Altman from AI.
Yeah, sorry, this is the only story anyone's talking about today. Has that like crossed over?
I just woke up. I've barely had a coffee yet. What's Sam doing? What's OpenAI doing?
In the course of the past 72 hours, Sam Altman was fired summarily and shockingly as the head of OpenAI. Then it appeared he was going to get rehired, came back into the building with a guest pass, was talking about it. In the meantime, all of the leadership of OpenAI said they were going to walk with him. So everyone thought the board's made a horrible decision. They're going to reverse course. Then they actually said, nope, we're not reversing course. We're sticking the landing. We're appointing the CEO of Twitch, this guy Emmett Shear, to be the head of OpenAI. It looked like Sam had lost. But no, he didn't, because Satya Nadella of Microsoft said, I'm hiring Sam under Microsoft, which owns OpenAI. And as of this recording, 700 of like 800 staffers are leaving OpenAI to work for Sam Altman at Microsoft. So
Get out.
Last time. It is Succession in real time, but like the entire, like all of the seasons collapsed into 72 hours. It's unbelievable.
Barry,
you have to go read about it.
Because I'm a selfish person, all I can think right now is last week I was going to buy some Microsoft stock, and I'll bet it's just gone up by 20%.
I mean, I assume that it has. I know nothing about stocks, but OpenAI, of course, is absolutely tanked. And the most crazy part of it is these are all new characters to me, but other than Sam, who I've been following and interested in for a while and came on the podcast, I think even the head of the board of OpenAI, a guy called Ilya, who's known Sam for a long time, involved in Y Combinator, I think he was the head of the board. 3 hours after the whole thing went down, he said, I regret my participation in this ouster. And even he is following. So the whole thing is
wow.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
I think Microsoft for the win, baby. I've been talking about Microsoft and AI for a while, mainly because I just borrow what I believe from like Scott Galloway and various other investors who I respect. But it's going to be so fascinating over the next 5 years to see how like large language models and machine learning disrupt the way that we live. I mean, I'm super interested in and who ends up taking the crown. I reckon Microsoft,
but
along with
one of the reasons this story is really interesting, and you'll have fun reading about it, is that the reporting's just starting to come out. But like, what are the deeper philosophical implications of it? Because obviously, it's insane, sort of like castle drama. But what I'm gathering from everything I'm reading is that if there was sort of a deeper philosophical disagreement that all of this was about, it was sort of the fight between the people yelling stop and saying AI is going to destroy civilization and swallow the world, there needs to be a pause, versus sort of the accelerationists that claim that rushing toward AI is sort of a moral obligation. So the fight between the accelerationists and the decelerationist seems to be sort of one of the threads in this story. Anyway,
Do you have an instinct on that, Barry?
I don't. I mean, in general, I would say that I'm sort of not with the dystopians. In general, I'm with the people who believe that technology is sort of a neutral force that can be used for good or bad. But in general, trying to stop its progress is not only a fool's errand, but often the people who have done it, when you sort of look back on history, look like fools. There's a really great I think it's on Substack, but there's a really great blog that tracks the reaction to like the wheel and the car and the slide rule. And everyone at every moment was saying this is going to be the downfall of civilization. And of course, all of those things...
there may be two things that you're conflating there. One is whether or not there's something different about this particular technological revolution and whether it could destroy us all. And the other is whether or not stopping it or pausing it is likely to be useful, right? Or feasible, like whether that's even... I think you can hold both of those. I mean, I think there is a non-zero chance that this could destroy civilization, and I also think there's no point in trying to pause it or prevent research into it. Yeah, humans are...
But do you think that only, from a strategic perspective, like if we pause, China's not going to pause, and therefore we have a moral obligation not to pause? Yeah,
basically, it's an arms race. Like, I'm glad we got the bomb. I'd rather live in a world with no nuclear bombs, but
I read like everything Tyler Cowen writes about AI, and I read some of these other people you've mentioned as well. I still don't understand how it works in the same way that if you ask me to describe how the internet works, I'm like, there are tubes under the ocean. Like, I don't know. But I got to be honest, like, pre-October 7th, I might have had a more cogent answer to that question.
But nobody does know how it works. That's what's terrifying about it. The people who are building it aren't quite sure why it's doing what it's doing. I mean, I heard someone describe it as being, it's like we've designed a portal and there are things coming out of the portal, and even the people who designed the portal aren't quite sure what the things are,
I know,
or what they're going to do, or what their intentions are. But we're like, these portals are amazing. Look at all the shit coming out of them. And, some people are saying, I'd be careful about the ghost portal that you're building. And nobody quite knows. Whereas with the internet, it is like, you remember the senator who tried to describe the internet as, he was like, the internet is not a truck. You can't just back it up and put all the information out of it. The internet's a series of tubes. And Al Franken, when he was senator, he got up and he said, well, you are right about one thing. The internet is not a truck.
There are tubes involved, I hear. I guess what I mean is, like, my mind was so much more sort of ranging and thinking about these kinds of issues that felt more theoretical. But right now, my mind has just been so fixated on the war and the widening war and what it means for the West. And
talk to me about that.
all of those extremely light subjects.
I mean, so there'll be some people listening to this, and maybe 10% of me is in this camp, which thinks we've been over this a million times since October 7th. We all know the basic parameters of what's happening. It's a tale as old as time. Two people want the same land. The Palestinian, certainly the bulk of public opinion in places like Australia and Europe, and increasingly probably in the US, is, I think, simplistically siding with the people who are hurting the most right now, which is Palestinians in Gaza. And
it's definitely not true in America. 75% or more of Americans still side with Israel. If you watch TikTok or Twitter, you might have a different perception of that.
Right. Yes, that would
definitely not the case in America.
From. So I think people side with Israel. I think most Australians would side with Israel in the sense that they think that Israel deserves to exist, and they think Hamas is a terrible organization. But I think they would also think that there are underlying problems about the long-term viability of Palestinian self-government that has made a conflict like this inevitable. And of course, chickens were going to come home to roost at some point, and it was not viable for Israel to keep an entire people in, open-air refugee camps in perpetuity. So something was going to give, and this was the horrible way in which it's giving. What's wrong with that?
Oh, I mean, the paradigm that you laid out in the beginning is wrong with that. This is not, the war is not about a contest over land. If it was a contest over land, as maybe your listeners don't recall, Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. It's been completely Judenrein since 2005. What the war is about is, what Hamas has in its charter. It's a war against Jewish existence. And that's why I think it's significant for the West, the world, and why, it's, as I've been reading, and I've been so curious actually and waiting for this conversation, because I'm so curious if my perception of what's happening in Australia is accurate to your experience of it, because it seems like the kinds of things I'm seeing on Twitter is that there has just been an explosion of sort of viperous Jew hate in Australia, in the way that there certainly has been across Western Europe, really, Europe writ large, and America as well. And the reason for that is because this isn't sort of a fight between two peoples that have contested claims to land, although that is true between Israelis and Jews, Palestinians and Arabs, but it's really about the desire to wipe the world of its Jews. And the notion that sort of Hamas would stop if somehow it got land is absolute farce.
I don't see the wiping the world of Jews thing, at least not overtly. And for my own mental sanity, I'm staying off social media, so I'm not seeing whatever you're seeing.
Oh my God. Okay.
My experience, like just as a journalist and a citizen, is that there is once again that people are responding to their post-colonial bias. Like, we have a laudable instinct in the West to be mindful of our history of colonialism. And so we just have a template or a heuristic onto which we superimpose every conflict, which says, if there's a poor brown person in rubble, that person is in the right. And if there's a whitish person or whiter person wearing a suit and talking fancy words who may be responsible for the brown person's plight, that person is a colonizer and they're in the wrong.
Right.
And
But that template is just collapses all moral distinction. And it's the reason that you see people across the West, including some of the most sort of pedigreed, educated people, making excuses or even celebrating mass rape, live incineration, the tying together of parents to their children, unspeakable acts of evil. It's why you see them justifying it, because they're falling for a framework that, at every single juncture of what you just said falls apart under when it touches reality.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. And I think people don't necessarily understand 1948. They don't necessarily understand 67 or 73. They don't necessarily understand Oslo. They don't understand the ins and outs of all this stuff. So,
but even my feeling about any of that is like none of that is really relevant to this moment. It's like none of that. You don't need to know anything about the establishment of the State of Israel, about 1967, about Oslo, about the pullout from, about any of that, to look at what Hamas did that day and say that is evil. And no amount of context, no amount of sort of historical nuance can justify it. And the fact that we have so many people who claim to be progressive, claim to be on the right side of history, who, cry crocodile tears over the slightest microaggression justifying it, tells you something like very, very scary and profound about the depth of moral, I would even say spiritual rot in our societies. And so when you say, like, why is this, what are the implications for the West? I think they're profound. Like, what does it mean to live in a culture in which college professors are saying that what happened on October 7th was awesome and that they're exhilarated by it? What does it mean when, an editor of the Harvard Law Review is trying to physically assault an Israeli student, as happened on Harvard's campus? What does it mean when, a public defender that my wife went to college with is seen tearing down the posters of kidnapped Israeli women and children? Like, what universe have we entered where that kind of morally inverted view of the world has become acceptable, even high status, really, and a sort of basic fundamental view of like good and bad, civilization and barbarism is seen as sort of like stupid or low status in some way. And that's, I think, where we are. And that, I think, should be concerning to everyone who wants to live in a country where the virtues that have made our lives possible, like, and I mean specifically our lives, are not protected because people either are taking them for granted, think they can sort of be tossed away, don't understand how fragile they are. And I think a lot of people, if there's a silver lining to the past few weeks, have sort of woken up, like real woke, to how fragile our freedoms are. And, even the word freedom, I'm sure, is like coded in some kind of politicized way for people, but not for me.
It's fascinating. I mean, the what comes to mind is just that it's worth separating out the various categories of wrong here, right? So the category of moral error that you're talking about, which is the people who actually would justify, let alone celebrate, what happened on October 7th, I'm just parking as so self-evidently awful that I'm just going to put that to the side, because I just don't think there are that many people who actually think that what Hamas did on October 7th was great.
But just think about, okay, fine, but put aside the people celebrating it. What about the silence? Think about, just take one example. Okay, there's evidence of crimes that I can't even talk about without breaking down on this video, that I'll just say rape as a weapon of war, but things that are significantly worse than just what you think about when you think of rape. I'm talking about people mutilated. Okay, I'm like, such unspeakable horrors happened. And yet, I'm on the listservs of many feminist organizations here in America who had a lot to say in the era of Me Too, who had a lot to say about horrible things that happened on casting couches. They have had nothing to say in the wake of this. Like, What is that if
Don't you
not a
think
moral
that they think that
catastrophe?
don't you think that they think that it's self-evidently wrong? So what's the point
No,
in saying?
no, absolutely not. I think they've been
Hmm.
completely subsumed by the sort of postmodern, post-colonial, morally relativistic view that you just laid out, which erases the distinction between good and evil and says that powerful, however you're defining that, is bad and suspicious. The powerless are necessarily good. And they have fallen into that trap when it comes to the story of, the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's what I think.
I mean, to me, what's interesting about this particular moment and this particular cultural rift that's kind of ballooning like a mushroom cloud out of the devastation of October 7th is I'm trying to, I guess, steelman the opposing point, right? So I think most listeners can understand why it's horrible to advocate or to celebrate for the rape and dismemberment of innocent civilians on October 7th. Where I think people find it confusing and where it's probably useful to try to tease apart what's going on psychologically is the attitude of course, that was horrible. And it's horrible for babies to be buried under piles of rubble because, they're living in Gaza, and it's horrible for people to have no aspirations for their future. This is why I go back to like the historical context, because the powerlessness and innocentness of the Palestinian people, not as individual human beings, but as a movement for national self-determination, actually is relevant in understanding the kind of moral valence here. If, since 1948, Israel had relentlessly pursued the subjugation of Palestinians and if the Arab states had welcomed the Jews with open arms, and the Jews had been persistent aggressors, and the Israelis had never provided a window of opportunity for Palestinian statehood, then I think the moral valence would actually be different, because you'd be able to, in terms of the steel manning option, I think there's a lot of what's going on, which is Hamas is terrible. What they did on October 7th is terrible. Also, Israel does terrible things. Both sides.
But it's,
so let's,
right.
That's the thinking, I think, which
Of
I
course,
find
but
harder to object to than,
I think,
rape is
Sam Harris, I really commend anyone listening to this to go listen to the episode Sam Harris has done on this. We reposted one of his in the Honestly feed, I think The Bright Line Between Good and Evil, but the one before that, I'm forgetting the title, which talks about intentionality and the idea that, in the case of Hamas, a genocidal death cult, the goal was to savage and maim and mutilate and murder as many Israelis as possible. And, again, I guess there are people who might not believe this. In the case of Israel, genociding the Palestinian people is simply not the goal. Wiping out Hamas is the goal. And as Sam has pointed out, if Israel wanted to genocide the Palestinian people, it could do that immediately, right now. And that's simply not the goal. If you look at the population that has swelled in Gaza over, we could like do this whole thing, but I also don't want to. I don't want to hijack the conversation, because I know you've done one with Eli and other people as well.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm just my heart is broken, and I'm incredibly nervous about the fate of not just the region, but all of Western liberalism, really. When you take what's going on in the Middle East with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with China's assertiveness, with the stresses that are being put on liberal democracy by forces of the far right and social media algorithms and whatever else, and then you add what I think is stressing us a lot as well, which we don't necessarily always notice, which is climate events, where we're just sort of being drained by the increasing regularity of wildfires and hurricanes and droughts. It's a big
happy
challenge.
time. It's a happy time.
But then, you know what, Barry? I'm also optimistic.
Oh, I am too. I'm a Jew. Of course I'm optimistic. I just want to say one thing about Israel, just lest anyone have any confusion about where I sit. I can say everything I just said about Hamas and believe that Bibi Netanyahu is a corrupt, power-hungry leader that needs to step aside for the good of Israel, that Jewish settlers in the West Bank that are terrorizing Palestinians right now are terrorists, and there can be such thing as Jewish terrorism. I mean, it's very possible to just hold all of these things in your head at once, that, that all of the children that are dying in the rubble in Gaza, it's horrible. It's a horrific tragedy. It's horrific. And, I'm holding it together now, but I mean, there have been so many nights since October 7th where I'm just looking at the news and just weeping. I mean, the fact that there are Israeli parents who have 3-year-olds, 10-month-olds. There's a woman from Thailand that gave birth in the tunnels under the Gaza Strip. The father of a little girl called Emily Hand, who was relieved when he thought she was dead, but then found out that she has been held by Hamas for the past 40 days. It's just horrific. I mean, the whole situation is just heartbreaking. It really is. But then we can pivot and talk about World War III and get really upbeat. No,
look, whenever I get down on history, I always remember that my dad was born in a refugee camp during World War II in Switzerland, as his parents, who were Holocaust, survivors, had been fleeing the Nazis, and it didn't stop my. People say, like, how could you bring a child into this world? This troubled world of climate change and chaos. And like, I don't know, things didn't look very good in 1943 for a Jew in occupied France either, but they went ahead, and I owe my life to that.
Yes, and it's also, I mean, it's the most optimistic thing in the world that you can do. Like, we have a 14-month-old, and it's just like, I just feel like the whole world has opened up for me. And I truly feel like I didn't understand the world before, but also it means that, the way that I consume news and the way that these stories impact you as a parent, I don't know how you feel, but I just feel it's really, really different. It's just much more profound.
Yeah, especially if it has to do with kids. I just blubber like a baby. I mean, there can be like an ad for AT&T where they're calling their kid abroad, and I'm like, it's so beautiful, the little baby.
How many kids do you have? Remind me.
Yeah, I have twins, 2 6-year-olds now, believe it or not. Would you believe?
So amazing.
But 14 months is great. I remember 14 months being a moment where they really stopped being an annoying lizard and turn into a human being.
It's amazing. It's amazing. That's
great.
But Nellie and I was sort of always thinking like 2 kids will be enough. And now I'm like, Nellie, as many as you want. We'll do it.
Yeah. That's great. Tune in next week for the 8-child, all in the family.
A Weiss family story.
That's right. I want to talk about the mainstream media. It's on my mind, the challenge of having institutions that are able to grapple with the most capacious possible expanse of ideas, and that are enthusiastic about triggering tripwires and running across the whole intellectual terrain instead of being risk averse and capturing themselves into the correct opinions about things is, I think, probably one of the big pressing challenges of the 21st century. And I wonder, can you just take us back for people who don't remember your origin story? What was it like?
Well, born in 1984. My parents tell me I was conceived on July 4th, which who knows if that's true. Okay, professionally, the thing that's relevant, I think, to your listeners, your viewers, is that people will remember the sort of very, very intense summer of 2020, where you had COVID lockdowns, then combined with Black Lives Matter, peaceful protests, but also riots in cities across the country. And I had been brought into the New York Times in the wake of Trump's election in a sort of brief window of soul searching that the paper experienced. How was it that the paper that prides itself on speaking to the country, on capturing the mood of the country, on holding up a mirror to the world as it actually is, how did they tell us, that Hillary Clinton was going to win with 99% certainty? And yet my mother, for her work, she has to sort of drive 2 hours outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and was calling me saying, I've never seen signs like this in my life. Trump's going to win. How did she get it right and the New York Times got it wrong? Well, that was a question they were wondering too. And to put it bluntly, I was brought in along with Bret Stephens from the Wall Street Journal as a kind of intellectual diversity hire. Now, it tells you a lot about the New York Times that like a pro-choice Jewish gay woman from the Midwest was their intellectual diversity, but there you go. And my job explicitly was to bring in voices that wouldn't otherwise naturally appear in the New York Times, either because other editors wouldn't think to commission them, or the writers themselves would think, the New York Times would never accept me. So that meant everyone from people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali to, the Iranian dissident Masih Alinejad, to underground pastors in China hiding their Christianity, to first-time writers, like you name it. But I think what I was known for was getting sort of non-progressive voices into the paper. So I remember specifically a piece by Thomas Chatterton Williams, the Black intellectual who I'm sure you've had on, or if not, you should, on Ibram Kendi, like things that were just spicy and a little hot to handle. And I loved it, and it was great. And from the very beginning, I was uncool. People there didn't like me. We can speculate about why that is. I think my support of Israel had something to do with it. But I could give a rat's ass because holy shit, I got to work at the New York Times. And the privilege, if I can use that word, if it hasn't been so sullied, of getting to reach so many people, of getting to publish my own pieces, was just so exhilarating and exciting. And it didn't matter to me that people kind of gave me the cold shoulder. Fast forward to the summer of 2020. The New York Times ran an op-ed by Republican senator from Arkansas named Tom Cotton. Who he is, kind of irrelevant. The point is that he published a pretty incendiary op-ed called Send in the Troops, which made the argument that not in the case of peaceful protesters, but in the case of violent rioting, that the National Guard should be brought in to put down the rioting. Now, this was misread. It was misconstrued to say he was talking about peaceful protesters. But in any event, it led to an absolute meltdown inside the newspaper. Something like 800 of my colleagues signed a letter. Some say the number was way higher, that this op-ed literally put their lives in danger. James Bennett, my boss who had hired me, who had formerly been the Jerusalem bureau chief, had covered the Second Intifada, had done a lot of things to sacrifice, his safety and his time and his, talents to the paper, was pushed out after 2 days. 2 other people were reassigned or demoted. And I found myself wondering what the hell I was doing. I had nothing to do with the piece. I didn't commission it. I didn't edit it. I only saw it when it appeared on the website like everybody else. But because I had been known as someone who sort of didn't go along with every aspect of the new orthodoxy, I was seen as suspicious. And what had been a sort of like cold hostility became hot. People in company-wide Slack channels were putting axe emojis next to my name, were openly asking in all company meetings when I was going to be fired. And, and I sort of faced a choice, Josh, and maybe it's a choice that you relate to. And the choice was this, I had seen what they had done to someone who had dedicated their life to the paper, and the way that his risk-taking, his specific mandate was to bring in other voices that wouldn't normally appear in the New York Times. That was sort of one of the great lessons from Trump, at least for a moment, of we're not listening to what half of the country is saying. Let's really listen. And what was his risk-taking intellectually rewarded with? Getting pushed out of the newspaper where he had spent his entire career. And I said to myself, like, if this is what they're willing to do to someone who has given so much of their life to the paper, what will they do to me if I have a misstep? And more to the point, like, it was an environment that was where it was already so difficult to sort of smuggle through heterodox ideas or controversial ideas or ideas that might rub a colleague the wrong way or might get you accused of, any one of the isms or phobes that you get accused of every day if you trip over those tripwires you mentioned. So do I stay and sort of cling to the prestige of being able to tell people I work at the New York Times, which at least, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan where I lived at the time was definitely an asset, maybe not in Arkansas, but definitely in Manhattan? Or do I leave? And do I leave to sort of pursue the curiosity that led me to become a journalist in the first place? And I left. And I left in a sort of very loud way with this open letter to the publisher of the newspaper, A.G. Sulzberger, and thus began a period of intense day drinking, weight gain, and casting about for what I would do next. And well, here I am doing what I decided ultimately to do next. But, it's a long-winded way of saying, like, it was like one of the few moments in my life where I sort of stepped back and said, like, what is the purpose of my life? And not to sound like precious about it, but really, like, what's the point of my career? What's the point of being a journalist? Is it, again, so I can brag and put the New York Times next to my name? Or is it because I believe that there is virtue in the work itself, work that is becoming increasingly impossible to do if I want to cling to the prestige? So what I am, of course, wondering if this at all resonates with your experience, and maybe you're not even free to talk about it yet, which I would totally understand, but you can just blink 3 times if this resonates with you.
That's right. I mean, I'm interested in how much of that was corporate cautiousness and arse covering and kind of legalistic desire to avoid bad PR and upsetting subscribers and like financial imperatives versus, and I'm wrestling with this myself, versus just an ideological blinkeredness, a blindedness, a sense that like we know what the right answers are here. Why do these troublemaking people like Bari keep coming around and asking complicated questions about issues that are actually quite simple? Like, we know what the just, position here is, and so stop screwing around, with your fancy games of free speech and alternative and what about this? Like, we have the answers. So shut up and suck it. Do you have a sense of which, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. I mean, I experienced it for the first time around the Me Too movement, where, I'm a lifelong feminist. And yet, I thought this very notion of believe all women reflexively was like an anti-humanist position. And really, in a way, like, just didn't square with reality. Like, women can lie just like everybody else. And it doesn't mean that the Me Too movement, wasn't in many ways virtuous and wasn't in many ways overdue. But I remember writing pieces around that time. I specifically one called Aziz Ansari is guilty of not being a mind reader that went very viral. And sort of for the first time made me think, oh, wow, like things that I think are commonsensical in the world, and that most people in the country would sort of nod along with and be like, yeah, isn't that obvious? Like, in the framework of the New York Times, felt like incredibly radical. And again, it was like, as you're saying, but the frame was the problem, right? Like, if, again, there are places that just announce themselves like, we are a left-wing publication, we are a socialist publication, we are a right-wing publication, and okay, so like, what you're going to get, and they're serving their readers. The conceit of the New York Times, and I think to a large extent this has sort of fallen away, is the idea that it's supposed to be sort of, as the word you used, capacious. It should be sort of trying to give voice to as many possible viewpoints inside the sort of 40-yard lines of American political life as possible. And in fact, it was giving you like a tiny sliver. And now the reason for that, part of it, of course, as you alluded to, is like the problem of audience capture, which, any schmo with a podcast experiences and the New York Times experiences. In other words, when the old economic model of having to serve the advertiser was replaced with having to serve your paying customer, everything shifted, right? It used to be that you had to worry about, something that would piss off Johnson & Johnson. Now, in the case, just not to pick on the Times, it's the model that I know most intimately. Like, if 95% of your readers are liberals and progressives, like, what they want. And what they want is another piece about how Donald Trump is a monster that's destroying democracy. And that's going to go viral, and that's going to work very well. And, and it becomes a cycle. And so there's an aspect of it where it's self-reinforcing. It's like no one had to come down from the corner office and say, hey guys, an op-ed saying Donald Trump is a monster is going to do well. Like, you would see it do well. And you would see it do well because you knew who the audience was and you knew what they liked. So that's certainly part of it. But I think actually that is condescending toward the audience, because I do think that, specifically in the case of the Times, people are curious. As much as it can annoy people to hear another perspective, they want to. And you could see this often reflected, not to get too tedious, in like reader comments, and the things that would get upvoted by other readers, where they would be like, hey, yeah, like, is J.K. Rowling really a monster? It kind of seems like she's saying something that seems somewhat reasonable. Upvote, you know? So you would see it in that way. But I think the big sort of headline story with the Times, and this is the case with like almost every sense-making institution in American life, is the story of how a small, ideologically committed, sophisticated, zealous group of people can overtake an institution by using the threat of moral condemnation, a threat that I didn't understand, Josh, until the past 5 years of my life, how unbelievably powerful that tool of social and reputational shame is. But wow, is it powerful.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that was sort of the way that it functioned at the Times. And, you know, let me just give you a tiny example. Like, you could feel yourself, and I felt this even inside my own self, like the way that self-censorship can work. Because, again, it's not someone saying to you, maybe don't do that story. Although sometimes that would happen too. It's more thinking, do I really want to spend the next 2 weeks of my life battling everyone sitting alongside me? Is it really worth it to die on this hill? You know, if I know that in the case, and there were literally 2 editorial tracks, progressive op-eds would just sail through. And so it was so easy, and it would make your life easier to just commission and edit those, as opposed to like anything else, like even classically liberal to the right of that would have to go through like 4 additional layers of editing, and everything would need to be contextualized and to be short. And like by the time you were done, you were just like gray. And you thought to yourself, like, hey, just make your life easier. And I just, like, the second I sort of felt that inside of me, there was something in me that raged against that, where I was like, those aren't my values, and I don't want to give in to that. And I also don't want to spend the next 10 years of my life banging my head against the wall. So there were many, to a long-winded way of answering your question. It functioned in like several different ways, but the key thing that was different, I would say, is like the New York Times had always been a liberal newspaper. What was different in the past decade, maybe even more so, is that there were people entering the paper who specifically did not believe in the mission of the New York Times, and believed that the mission of the New York Times should not be independent, or independent to the greatest extent possible journalism that, you know, would try and reflect the world as it is, but journalism as a political tool, journalism as a way to assert their vision of the world as they wish it would be. And that really was the change. And when I wrote at the time about the sort of generational civil war that was playing out, like, that is not only the case at the New York Times, the case at so many other institutions as well.
I mean, there's a prior change that's even more insidious that's necessary for that change, which is the change in people's understanding of their own fallibility, a change in people's appreciation of their own epistemic limits, a change in people's empathy intellectually for other people's positions. Like, I don't think people are coming into these institutions thinking, I disagree with diversity of opinion and I want to turn this into my own political puppet. I think what they're thinking is, why wouldn't you want this to be a tool for good?
Exactly.
Why wouldn't you want this to be a tool for a better world?
Right.
Why would you want to play around with all this stuff that we already know to be wrong?
Correct.
And to me, the real problem that's causing all of this in the media is less an institutional takeover and more, why do these people have this worldview that they can be so deranged as to believe that is justified, because they lack the understanding of like a classical liberal tolerance for a range, for a diversity of views that they disagree with. I mean, that for me is where all this is coming from.
Yeah, they don't think that truth is something you get to with, you know, slight nudges, slight discoveries, tweaks, you know, like a push and then a counter push and the sort of sharpening that comes from disagreement. They think truth is something that is known and that we need to like spread the good word about what it is.
Yeah, it's obvious. It's obvious.
Yeah, it's obvious.
I had similar run-ins during Gay Pride where I was trying to take a position. You know, I'm a bit conflicted about Gay Pride, and I think I have some standing as a guy who's married to a guy to ask questions about whether there ever comes a point at which it becomes counterproductive to keep pumping young teenagers full of very cliched images of oiled up white gay males, sitting astride giant inflatable penises driving down your Sixth Avenue. Like, does there come a point at which sexual flourishing and emotional well-being would be better served by turning down the volume on identity and turning up the volume?
Sound like a self-hating internalized homophobia to me, Josh.
That's right. So, and like that point of view,
yeah,
inside an institution that has been persuaded that the contemporary gay rights movement is on the right side of history, is by definition a retrograde, bigoted, anti-gay, homophobic point of view. So it doesn't need engaging with, and it really shouldn't be aired. Like that to me is the change. That's bizarre.
The thing I'm describing as experiencing at the Times is that sort of the norm in Australia, because I always think of Australia as being like slightly more sane than us, maybe because, well, I don't actually know why I think that. That was just my impression when I spent time there. People just seemed like,
I think we are more
commonsensical,
less extreme.
Yeah,
I think we're less extreme in every way, and that's for better and for worse, right? We wouldn't have elected Donald Trump, but then we wouldn't have elected Barack Obama either. America is just a slightly more crazy place. The dials are turned up to 11 in America,
yes.
and that's one reason why we love it, and one reason why it keeps shooting itself in the foot in various ways.
Yeah.
But I think there's a coziness in Australia that's not necessarily helpful. There's a sense of we have a phrase like "she'll be right." She'll be right.
What does that mean,
mate? I mean, it's going to be fine.
It's going to be fine.
Don't worry about it. Smooth sailing. Don't ruffle feathers.
Right.
The tall poppy syndrome is an Australian phrase.
That fascinated me. Yes, that's the opposite of. It's just so antithetical to, I don't know, like that. Well, yeah, but just like, how do you create a culture where people want to take risks and pursue excellence if
it's not a culture of exceptionalism? It's
not
a culture of egalitarianism, which has its own upsides. I think it's a culture of like the fair go, and like no one should be able to fall too far, but also nobody should be able to rise too high. Like,
so what are you moving here?
I spent most of my professional life in New York City. I mean, I've only been back here for 6 years now. And I think precisely because of the tenor of the rest of the media in Australia, I think it's ripe for me to go full Bari Weiss. And I don't know whether that means actually creating a media institution yet. I'll noodle on that. But I'll certainly spend the next bit of time without bosses and having the conversations that I think Australians are super hungry for. So,
oh God, wow! I'm so excited for you.
Thank you, Bari. Thank you for being here.
I do have to say, by the way, that it did strike me, and partly this is because I've been to Australia exactly once, but I claim to know something about it simply from that time. No, it's that when we boarded the flight, moms of young children boarded first, and there were also bassinets on the planes for babies. And then, I don't know, that made such an impression on me just because, no, it's pathetic. The first time you change a baby's diaper in an airplane bathroom where there's nothing you're just like, oh my God, this is the least family friendly situation in the world.
Yes.
But also everything about Australia seemed really built for families in a way that you don't see as much here. And it did seem like a genuinely great place to raise children.
Yeah, exactly. That was it as well. I mean, it's like, who wants to be, I love New York City, but who wants to be struggling with a stroller going down an icy, steps into a subway station and worrying about what private school your kid is going to get into in order to, like preschool to get into the right, high school and the healthcare and life's more. Americans like making things complicated for themselves when there are actually fairly easy solutions in some ways that other rich countries have figured out.
Totally. So what are you thinking? What are you when you think about going independent, are there guests and topics that you sort of cautioned yourself away from that now you're
Yes.
thinking you're going to run headlong toward them?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't want to. I don't. My goal has never been to just upset apple carts for the sake of upsetting apple carts. So I'm not going to run directly towards the electrified fence and and self-immolate just for the sake of it. I just want my curiosity to be able to roam where my curiosity wants to roam. I want my inquisitiveness to feel unbounded. I just want to be able to talk in ways that I think people will find sane and refreshing without feeling like we're constrained inside the proper ways of conversing about proper things. There's just so much talking at the moment, and I'm not talking specifically about the ABC, my employer. I'm talking in general terms about culture and media. There's so much talking in ways that seem designed to prove to the audience that we are on the right side of worthy issues, instead of to actually wrestle with the meat and guts and blood of stuff and get to the bottom of it. So that's all
Yeah.
I want to do. I'm not going in with an agenda apart from that.
Are you still going to call it Uncomfortable Conversations?
Yeah, I think that'll always be the flagship show.
It's
But then do
great.
we have offshoots and do we have sub podcasts and things? And I mean, I love what you guys did with the J.K. Rowling podcast.
Thank
I thought
you.
that was fabulous.
Thank you.
And so, sub projects that either I or other people do within the main project, does that end up having a different umbrella name? I mean, I quit less than a week ago, Barry. Give me a
I
break.
know, but
How much planning do you want?
I have grand ambitions for. I mean, I just think the opportunity is so. Like here's the like specific niche that I think is so powerful if you can hit it, and I know you will, is that you have the legacy press. I don't even call it the mainstream press anymore because I just don't think it's like representative of the mainstream. But you have the legacy press that has the prestige and the glossiness and all of the old rules when they're followed properly, like fact checking, like 2 sources for every single fact in a story that are extremely valuable. And then you have a lot of people sort of like going wild and going ham in like the Wild West pod newsletter Twitter world. And then you have a sort of great gap between those two things. And the people that can kind of marry the intellectual freedom of the Wild West world without giving into the conspiratorial rabbit hole tendencies that capture much of that world, and can marry that genuine freedom with the responsibilities that come with the best parts of the legacy press. Like, I think that the opportunity for that is just enormous. And that's what we're really, really trying so hard to do here. But I think people are so hungry for that specific thing. And I think that a lot of the people who are willing to take the risk and have the confidence to leave the old world and build that, like, those are the people I'm sort of paying the most attention to, because it's like they've had the kind of training that you think, that you hope will give them the ability to pull off that sort of high wire act.
It's a good way of putting it. That's the sweet spot. Lastly, how do you avoid audience capture? How do you avoid drifting towards crazy town?
It's a great question. First of all, I think everyone is susceptible to audience capture. There's lots of little tricks you can do. I know Sam Harris never looks at the numbers. And, I've talked to lots of people who I think pull it off well. For me, it's been about not making it Bari Weiss Inc. Like, it's, as I said, there are 20 people that work here, and they're not just like producing this show. There's one producer full-time on this show. There are reporters who we want to make into, superstars. There are, hosts of other shows that we're developing. The goal is to sort of make it the Justice League of people that want to do old school, independent-minded, fearless journalism. And for me, that's the trick. Like, if 2 or 3 years from now, someone sends someone a link from the Free Press and my name's not invoked and it has authority on its own, like, that's really the goal. And for me, like, I have strong opinions about like 10 subjects. There are hundreds of other subjects that I either know nothing about or bore me, or I'm just completely out of my depth. And so for me, it like, this formulation just makes a lot of sense. And I also think it guards you against audience capture, because there are 20 people here with 20 extremely different views about, say, the war in Ukraine, or, you know, American foreign policy. This is just like a topic we've been talking a lot about. And that back and forth, I think, keeps you really honest, because otherwise you're kind of just hearing yourself and then hearing the audience talk back to you. But it's also a matter of just like, frankly, like discipline and a real sense of like what your North Star is, because it was super clear to me from the early days of this that like I could probably run a piece about how bad cancel culture is every single day and make a lot of money doing it and like maybe afford a second home for my family. But then I had a kind of like moment of confronting myself the way I had at the New York Times and saying like, but wait, like, wouldn't this be replicating exactly the thing that I criticize those people for doing? And like, I've seen enough people become caricatures of themselves. Like, I don't want to do that, even if it does afford me a second home. Like, I'd much rather try and build something that lasts, you know, to try and build a new institution in a world in which our faith in the old ones has crumbled. And so in many ways, like the decision to build something that is like a real institution and not just me is a selfish thing because I so clearly saw what might come of me if I didn't surround myself with other very, very smart, capable people who had strong views of their own.
And
that's a good way. Really
that's a good trick. Yeah, I've been having to do it solo in terms of just batting away the people who want to drag you into their alternative echo chamber. You know, the number of requests that I've had from Australia's equivalent of Fox News or, you know, from conservative media outlets saying, oh, come on and talk about, and I'm like, no, excuse me, I'm not your puppy dog. Don't just think that because I had, you know, some, you know, particular beef about freedom of speech or cancel culture that means that all of a sudden I'm on your side. Like, stop being such ridiculous team players. Like, can't you just be independent? And so, yes, but I think you're wise to create support structures around yourself that keep calling you out on bullshit. Yeah, basically. All right, Bari Weiss, Justice League leader extraordinaire. Thank you.
Come visit us. Come visit us in LA.
I will come and visit next year, and that's a promise. Thanks for speaking with us. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you too. I'm so excited to see what you do.